Welcome back to the Political Brief. Today, we're looking at a Senate exchange that quickly turned into a debate over one of the most controversial questions in American politics: sex, gender, and fairness in competitive sports. Senator John Kennedy presses a witness on a series of very basic biological questions, and the answers lead to an increasingly tense exchange over whether biological sex gives athletes a physical advantage. Watch this exchange closely because the disagreement here goes far beyond terminology. It gets directly into fairness, parental rights, and the future of women's sports.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses here today. Ms. Robinson, I want to follow up by trying to understand your answer to one of Senator Cruz's questions. And this is really a question, not a suggestion. Do I understand your position to be that there are two sexes, but there can be more than two genders?
I wouldn't even say two, and we've got Dr. Lopez here as well, but there's also the definition of intersex. I think that often in these conversations we're conflating sex and gender, and I do want to affirm here that trans women are women. That is their gender.
Okay, but I'm trying to understand. Do you make a distinction between sex and gender?
Yes, sir.
Okay, explain that. Do you think there are more than two sexes?
I believe that there's a definition for intersex as well that I want to acknowledge. But sex is assigned at birth.
I'm just trying to understand. I'm thoroughly confused. So you're born, I'm talking about biology, male, female, and what else?
I believe that intersex is also acknowledged. But again, I'm not a doctor here. What I can
and
say
what does intersex mean?
Is that there's a difference between sex and gender. And I think in these conversations, we're conflating the two.
Well, but I want to start with sex. Okay, there's male, there's female. When a baby's born, before the baby has had time to even have a sense of self, there's male, female, and intersex. There's a third sex.
I believe that is true, but I would defer to Dr. Lopez as I'm not a physician.
Okay. And how many genders are there?
I think the gender is expansive, and the definitions are always growing. Today I can tell you, I talk to young people that talk about non-binary as
more than five.
I think the gender is not a binary, is what I'm trying to say.
Are there more than five genders? I'm just trying to understand. Are there more than five genders?
Well, I think that there was a time where women wearing pants didn't feel like it was appropriate for their gender, and yet I'm wearing pants today. I think that there are ways that we express our gender that are expansive.
Are there more than five?
I wouldn't subject myself to naming how many genders there are, but what I can say is that gender is a reflection.
Number?
Excuse me?
There's an infinite number of genders?
I think depending on your culture, there are a lot of different genders that exist. And I can also say that it's a term that's evolving. If you look at young people today, they really don't lean into the binary of only woman and man. So I think that it's incumbent upon us not to legislate on this, but create space for them to explore what their identities are, what their gender identities are.
Let's get back to athletics. I think I understand what you're saying. There are three sexes: male, female, and intersex.
I believe that to be true, but again, I'm not a physician.
And there are an infinite number of genders because gender is a mental state.
Gender is about expression, and I think that there are a variety of ways that you can express your gender.
Okay, so there's infinite number. All right, let's go back to the biology. Male, female, boy, girl. Okay, biologically, do males have an advantage over females biologically in sports?
Again, I'm not a physician, and I can't speak to that.
What's your real-world experience?
It depends. There are some people who are born male that I'm faster than if I were to sprint against them, and some that I'm not. Some males that are taller than some women, and some that are shorter.
You don't believe that a biological male has a physical advantage in sports over a biological female?
not as a definitive statement.
Give me an example. Well, no, I don't think. How many female members of the NBA do you see?
Well, I can say that, there's been this news article about men that think that they could beat Serena Williams in tennis, right? That they think that they could actually score a point on her. And it's just not the case. She is stronger than that.
What's your experience, Ben? Male, female?
Both Serena and Venus lost to the 203rd ranked male tennis player, which they're phenoms for women. My experience, my husband, he swam at University of Kentucky as well. In terms of accolades and in terms of national ranking, I was a much better swimmer than him. He could kick my butt any day of the week without trying.
Okay. I just think, Ms. Robinson, I'm trying to understand where you're coming from. I think you lose a lot of credibility when you don't concede that a biological male has physical advantages over a biological female. I mean, I just think that's a proven fact, and you really hurt your credibility. I understand you want the world to be a better place. I do too, and I don't think people ought to be discriminated against because of an immutable characteristic. I don't. And I think that I think everybody ought to be free to be themselves. And what you do in your bedroom or what I do in my bedroom with a consenting adult is nobody's business. But if what I do in my bedroom with a consenting adult, if I decide I want to tell somebody's child about it, then other people have rights too. And I think parents have rights. And I think biological females have rights to be able to compete fairly in sport, in sports. So I really think you hurt your credibility when you refuse to acknowledge that biological males have an advantage over biological females. It kind of makes me wonder about all your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Kennedy. I'm sorry, go ahead.
What I'm trying to say is that there is not a definitive advantage in all cases. Sir, I don't know if you believe that you could beat Serena Williams in tennis, but I probably think that that's not the case. There are not all cases where all men are physically superior to all women. And at the end of the day, in this conversation, we're not talking about that. We're talking about trans women who are, in fact, women, who deserve to play in a gender that matches their sports, who deserve all the benefits that Ms. Gaines is talking about. And as a cisgender black woman, I can say definitively that my womanhood is not threatened by a transgender person asserting hers as well.
Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all of the persons who are testifying today. For Ms. Robinson, do you know what...
That exchange is worth unpacking because underneath all of the terminology and political disagreement is a fairly straightforward question. Does biological sex matter when it comes to competitive athletics? In my view, absolutely. But that doesn't mean every person who disagrees with Kennedy is acting in bad faith. The witness was clearly trying to make a distinction between biological sex and gender identity. Her argument was essentially that sex and gender aren't necessarily the same thing, that intersex conditions exist, and that gender identity can be broader than simply male or female. That's a legitimate distinction to discuss. But where the questioning became especially important was when Senator Kennedy moved away from definitions and brought the conversation back to athletics. Because sports aren't primarily organized around how someone feels about themselves. They're organized around measurable physical characteristics: speed, strength, power, endurance, body composition, and, depending on a sport, things like skeletal structure and muscle mass can matter enormously. That's why we have separate men's and women's competitions in the first place. If there were no meaningful physical differences between the sexes for athletic purposes, there would be little reason to separate most competitions by sex. And this is where I think Kennedy made his strongest point. He wasn't arguing that every biological male is stronger or faster than every biological female. That's obviously not true. There are individual women who are faster, stronger, or more athletic than individual men. But competitive sports aren't about comparing random individuals. They're about creating categories where athletes have a reasonable opportunity to compete against others with comparable physical characteristics. That's an important distinction. And the witness's response, that there isn't a definitive advantage in every individual case, is technically a different argument from the one Kennedy was making. Kennedy wasn't saying that every man can beat every woman. He was asking whether biological males, as a group, possess physical advantages relevant to athletic competition. And that's a much more specific question. Consider elite tennis. Kennedy brought up Serena and Venus Williams and their famous match against a lower-ranked male player. The point wasn't that Serena or Venus weren't extraordinary athletes. They obviously were. The point was that elite male and female athletic performance isn't identical. And that's not an insult to women. Quite the opposite. The reason women's sports exist as a distinct competitive category is precisely because women's athletic achievements deserve their own space. You can acknowledge biological differences without diminishing anyone's dignity. And that's an important principle that seems to get lost in these debates. There are really two separate questions here. The first is whether transgender people deserve dignity and protection from unfair discrimination. The second is whether athletic organizations should use biological sex, gender identity, hormone levels, or some other criteria when determining eligibility for women's competitions. Those aren't necessarily the same question. Someone can believe that transgender Americans should be treated with respect and still believe that women's competitive sports require sex-based eligibility rules. Likewise, someone can believe transgender athletes should be allowed to compete according to their gender identity without believing that biological differences are completely irrelevant. Those are policy disagreements, and policy disagreements should be debated honestly. What concerns me about exchanges like this is when the discussion gets trapped in terminology instead of dealing with the practical consequences. If we're talking about sports, we have to talk about sports. If we're talking about biology, we have to talk about biology. And if we're talking about civil rights, we should talk about civil rights. Mixing all three together makes it almost impossible to have a productive conversation. Kennedy also raised another important issue when he talked about parents. That's the question of who gets to decide what children are exposed to, particularly when discussions about gender and sexuality enter schools or other environments involving minors. Reasonable people can disagree about where that line should be. But parents aren't unreasonable for wanting transparency about what their children are being taught. And they're not unreasonable for wanting a voice in decisions involving their children. At the same time, we should be careful not to turn every disagreement over curriculum or gender identity into an accusation that someone is trying to harm children. That kind of rhetoric shuts down discussion just as quickly as refusing to acknowledge biological realities does. There's another moment in this exchange that deserves attention. The witness says that gender is expansive and that the definitions continue to evolve. That may accurately describe how some people and institutions currently understand gender. But Kennedy's frustration appears to come from something much simpler. He's asking whether there are objective categories. When someone asks, how many genders are there? And the response is essentially that the number is constantly evolving. That leaves an obvious policy problem. If the government is going to legislate around a concept, lawmakers need definitions that can actually be applied consistently. You can't create effective laws if nobody can clearly explain what the terms in those laws mean. But there is an important counterargument here. People who support broader definitions of gender would say that not every aspect of human identity needs to fit into a fixed government classification. They would argue that personal identity can be complicated and that government shouldn't unnecessarily interfere with private decisions. That's a serious argument, too. And that's why this issue isn't solved simply by shouting one side down. The sports question, however, is different because competition requires rules. Imagine a boxing organization saying weight doesn't matter because every individual athlete is unique. That wouldn't make sense. We have weight classes because physical differences can dramatically affect competition. Similarly, we divide sports by age, sex, and sometimes other characteristics because the goal is to create meaningful competition. The challenge for policymakers is determining exactly where those lines should be drawn. Should eligibility be based entirely on sex at birth? Should hormone levels be considered? Should individual sports establish their own rules? Should there be separate categories in certain sports? Those are legitimate questions, and there isn't necessarily one answer that works perfectly for every sport. A contact sport raises different safety concerns from swimming. Swimming raises different questions from shooting. Track and field raises different questions from gymnastics. So I don't think policymakers should pretend that one blanket rule automatically solves everything. But I also don't think policymakers should pretend biology doesn't matter. That's where I think Kennedy's questioning landed an important point. You can support individual freedom. You can oppose discrimination. You can believe adults should generally be free to live their lives as they choose. And you can still believe that competitive women's athletics needs meaningful protections. Those positions aren't inherently contradictory. And perhaps that's the bigger lesson from this hearing. America has become increasingly polarized over questions of identity, biology, education, and individual rights. Too often, each side assumes the other side is motivated by hatred. That's not productive. Most people want fairness. Most parents want their children to be safe. Most athletes want a fair opportunity to compete. And transgender Americans, like everyone else, want to be treated with dignity. The difficult part is determining how those interests should be balanced when they come into conflict. That's where lawmakers, athletic organizations, parents, athletes, scientists, and the public need to have an honest conversation. And honest conversations require something that was sometimes missing from this exchange: a willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable facts, even when those facts don't fit neatly into your preferred political narrative. Biological sex is real. Gender identity is a significant part of how some people understand themselves. Intersex conditions exist. Physical differences between male and female athletes exist. And transgender people exist. All of those statements can be true at the same time. The real policy debate begins when we ask what those facts should mean for laws, schools, sports, and public institutions. That's the conversation Americans should be having. Not simply, which side are you on? But rather, what rules are fair, what rules are workable, and how do we protect everyone's basic rights? Because if we're going to make laws that affect millions of Americans, slogans aren't enough. Definitions matter. Evidence matters. Biology matters. And individual rights matter too. That is ultimately why this Senate exchange deserves attention. Kennedy's questioning wasn't simply about terminology. It exposed a much larger disagreement about whether government policy should prioritize biological sex, gender identity, individual autonomy, or some combination of all three. And that debate isn't going away anytime soon. If you found this breakdown useful, make sure to subscribe to The Political Brief, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this video with someone who wants to understand the argument beyond the headlines.